Alright, this video is to help us understand how to describe one variable data, which is typically on histograms and box plots. And there are 4 different ways to describe the data. Those 4 are called center, shape, spread, and outliers. So we're going to take a look at what those 4 mean and how to describe the graphs with them. So the first 3 names of things, center, spread, and shape, all describe the distribution of data, or how the data is spread out across the graph. So those all 3 do the same exact thing, but they are found using little different things. And they're a little different, but they all represent how far they're spread out. So the first one we'll focus on is center. The center is the center or the median of the data, and it best represents the middle of all of the numbers. So in this example, we have the middle, or the center, right here, is at that highest graph, and you can see half of the data is on each side. It's definitely equally spaced out. So that most likely represents the center of all of the numbers. So we're going to talk about, sometimes it's not as easy to see as this one being the center column there. So center can be a couple of different things. Center can either be the median, which in that case, in the previous example it was, which the median is when we list out all the numbers and put them in order. So for example on that one, let's say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Our center was 3. So that was pretty easy, and that was the median part, okay? But however, if it is the mean, that means you average all the data. So add them all up and divide by the number of data points. And sometimes the mean is going to be our center, and sometimes the median will be our center. So we're going to see when do we do each of those. But like, why are there 2 different ones? So the median and the mean may be different. They're going to be both describing the center, but some of them, depending on what the graph looks like, will be different from each other, which you should see from the example in class. So sometimes we're going to use the median and sometimes we're going to use the mean. So we're going to typically use the mean. So that is the average of all the data. That typically shows us where the middle is. However, if we're going to talk about this word later, it says skewed. If the data is skewed, we're going to use the median instead. So you're going to make sure you want to write that down. The mean is normal. If the graph is not called skewed, which again we'll talk about. And then if the data is skewed, you're going to use the median instead, which is if you list all the numbers out and find the middle. Okay. So now we're going to move on to shape, which is another way to describe histograms, and it describes kind of the shape and the distribution of the data. There's 2 ways to describe this shape, vertical and horizontal. Okay. So we're going to talk about some words. Oops. Let's get rid of that. I forget how to do that now. That thing, I think. Okay. So we're going to talk about both vertical and horizontal and which ones are called which. So this is talking about the shape of the graph. Okay. So describing the shape of the graph is horizontal and vertical. So we have these all 4 different graphs. They look a little bit different. So we're going to say, okay, how do we describe the shape the best? So we're going to have a couple of different names for things. So that's why we're going to do horizontal and vertical. So I mean by horizontal is kind of how they're spaced out this direction. These ones are all kind of spread out equally. And then if we notice here, they're definitely more focused on this side. This one's again equal. This one's kind of spread out more on the right side. So that's what I mean by horizontal. Vertical is kind of the heights of all the graphs. These ones are kind of like a triangle. These ones are all kind of the same. So we're going to talk about what the difference is between those. Okay? So this is about shape. So for the vertical part, there's 3 different ways to call the vertical pieces of it. So uniform means they're going to all be basically straight across. They're going to all end at the same height. Okay? So for example, that would be, if those are all bars, they all look pretty much the same with that. Okay? If it's single peaked, that's going to mean that it kind of looks like a point like that. So maybe there's one in the middle that's taller than the rest of them. So let me scroll that down so you can see that. So single peaked means there's one highest point in all of the graphs. So that green is the single peaked down there. Okay, and then double peaked is let's do blue. So double peaked means kind of goes like, oops, how do I pick that one? So you're experiencing some first times. So maybe not. So there's blue. So single or double peaked means kind of looks like there's two, maybe like a mountain. So we have, it gets taller and it gets shorter again, and it gets a little taller again and gets shorter. So that one would be called double peaked. Okay, so that's kind of ways to describe the height of the graphs, which is all about the shape of the graph. Okay. Now we're going to talk about horizontally. There's only two ways to describe that horizontally, which is basically how wide things are spread out. So symmetric is going to mean they're all equal spaced. Okay. So they're all kind of equally spread out. There's some on the left, some on the right. Okay. They're all just kind of there. So that's that. There, you can see it now. Okay, so then the other kind, skewed, which we mentioned earlier, that kind of means things are maybe leaning. It's like one-sided or not equal. So an example of that, which we're going to look at some of these, example is maybe all the data points are kind of over here. If you remember when we did the pennies, and some of you guys had really big numbers, but most of them were in one section, because then you have a little one over here. So all the data is mostly over here, but then there's some stuff out on the outside. So that would be called skewed. So when it's all equally spread out, that's called symmetric. It looks symmetrical for the most part. There's kind of stuff in each of the spots. And then skewed is kind of things are one side versus the other some more. Okay, so all of those we're going to use to describe the shape. So let's see here. So these are all for shape. So we're just going to look at a few graphs and decide. So if we look at the vertical aspect of it, so how the heights of all the bars are. They're not all the same height, so it's not uniform. It's going to be single peaked because they kind of just all go to that middle point, and the heights are going up and then going back down. So that's a single peak, that's the vertical part of it. And then horizontal describes how wide they're spread out. So they're all actually equally spaced out here. So that's going to be called symmetric. So there's something in each of the bins. It's not like left-sided versus right-sided. It's all kind of equal. So that's going to be for our first one there. Okay. Number 2, vertical means about the heights. The heights are all pretty much consistent, so we're going to say that that's uniform. And some of these things are, what's the word for it? They are subjective. That's the word for it. So most of it is going to be uniform in this case. And then horizontally, how widely spaced out are they distributed this way? They're pretty much equally spaced out, so I'll say that's symmetric also. Okay. So another example. Now we're going to see something different. So the heights, it is probably single peaked, this one, because it has a height part right there, and then it goes down, it doesn't go back up again. And then the horizontal version of it is definitely skewed. All of the data is definitely in this half versus the right side, so that would be called skewed. So we're going to say both of these things to describe the shapes. Okay. Last one about shape, the height, vertical, I would think that could possibly be double peaked because there's kind of 2 high points in it, so we'll call that double peaked. And the horizontal version of its shape is skewed. Definitely more of the data is on this side than the other side. Okay? So that's how we'll describe shape, those 2 things for every graph. Okay? Almost done spread is, again, another way to show how spread out it is, but it's going to be a number. Oops. Going to be a number, and it's actually something you already know how to find. It's the interquartile range. So that was, we took the 3rd quartile minus the 1st quartile. So that's something you actually already know how to do, but we're just going to give it a new fancy name. So that is called the spread, is the same thing as the interquartile range. Last thing is something, again, you already know, is outliers, which are numbers which are most far away from other data points, and they don't really fit in the pattern. So we'll see that, if you saw that in the penny stuff, where, say we have a graph here, here's all of our things, and then we get one way over there. So you have one bin over there. So that's kind of an outlier, something that doesn't really fit with everything else. Okay, so make sure you took some notes here, and you can go back and watch this video if you need to.